Sometimes you got to face the hard stuff. And today we're diving into something that's really tough to talk about. We're looking into Texas's state-supported living centers, those SSLCs.
And we're using this investigative piece from Texas Watchdog as our guide. Smoke, mirrors, and broken promises.
Yeah, it really grabs your attention, doesn't it? But the thing is, it's not just a catchy title. It really reflects what's going on here. This isn't just like another news story. This is about a system that was supposed to protect people, and it's failing.
And what's really interesting is that this article, it takes us all the way back to like the very beginning of these SSLCs. Because it wasn't always this way. These places, they didn't start out as, these places known for neglect and abuse.
Yeah, it's true. When they first started, it was all about creating a haven, like a supportive place where people with disabilities could, really thrive.
Exactly, like a complete shift from those old institutions, those cold, sterile places. The idea was personalized care, a sense of community. That was the goal.
So how did we get from that vision to, this? Because now it's all accusations, right? Abuse, neglect, even deaths. It's like, what happened?
Well, it's a long story, but there was a big turning point back in 2009. The Department of Justice, they launched a huge investigation.
And I remember when that happened, it seemed like there were just all these stories coming out about what was going on in those SSLCs.
Right. And it was all those reports, all those voices that finally forced the issue. And what the DOJ found, it was really disturbing. I mean, we're talking about systemic failures everywhere you looked. Physical abuse, neglect, even residents being taken advantage of. Mm-hmm. The very people the system was supposed to be helping, they were being hurt by it.
And they didn't just give them a slap on the wrist either, right? I mean, this Texas Watchdog piece, it talks about all these specific cases that are just heartbreaking. Like that whole thing at the Lubbock SSLC, 17 deaths, 17 residents, all under suspicious circumstances. And it was all between just 2004 and 2005.
Yeah, and what makes it worse is that there wasn't any transparency. Like they just swept it under the rug instead of trying to figure out what really happened and hold someone accountable.
And that seems to be the pattern, doesn't it? Like they just don't want to deal with the root causes. And those stories, man, they stay with you. That fight club at the Corpus Christi SSLC, that one really got to me. Staff forcing residents to fight, some of them with severe autism. Can you imagine?
Awful.
Yeah.
And then there's the case of Sean Yates. He had Asperger's, and he ran away from that same facility, the one in Corpus Christi. Mm-hmm. And they knew he had a history of running away, but they still reduced his supervision.
And he ended up dead. It's just, like, how does a system that's supposed to protect people, how does it fail so badly?
And then there's another case, another young guy, this time at the Richmond SSLC. He died from, get this, blunt force trauma.
Oh, man.
Yeah, some staff members were indicted. But it still makes you wonder, how often does this kind of stuff happen and nobody ever hears about it? It just makes you sick.
And these aren't just stories, you know? These are real people, and they were failed by the very system that was meant to keep them safe. And the thing is, this wasn't some, hidden problem, right? They knew things were bad. We talked about that $112 million settlement. Remember, the one that was supposed to fix everything?
Oh, yeah. Back in 2009. That was supposed to be the big turning point. All these reforms, independent oversight, it seemed like they were finally going to make some real changes.
Right. But this Texas Watchdog article, they don't hold back. They called it, get this, window dressing for a rotten core.
Ouch.
Yeah, and that's kind of what it feels like, doesn't it? Like, did any of that money actually help the people living in those places?
Well, that's the thing. The article says that by 2014, most of the SSLCs were only about 30% compliant with those reforms. 30%? Can you believe that?
It's unbelievable. It's like, imagine spending all that money, right? Like, you're paying for a total renovation, and all you get is, one wall painted.
A very expensive paint job.
Exactly. And speaking of expensive, we got to talk about the cost of all this, because you'd think with fewer people living in these SSLCs, it would cost less to run them, right?
You would think so, but no. Back in 2015, the average cost per resident was over $210,000 per year.
Per year. Seriously.
Per year. And during that same time, enrollment dropped by something like 70%.
So more money, fewer people, same problems. Where's all that money even going?
It's a good question. Especially when you consider that there are other options out there, like community-based care, which is not only more humane, it's also cheaper.
Yeah, the article mentions those, right? Like home and community-based services and that Texas Home Living program.
Exactly. Those programs focus on getting people integrated into the community, living more independently. They might have their own place or live in a smaller setting, but they get support tailored to their needs.
Sounds like a much better approach. So why aren't we doing more of that? If it's better and it costs less, it seems like a no-brainer, right?
Well, There are some roadblocks. The biggest one is funding. Those programs are constantly underfunded, so they have these insanely long waiting lists. They just don't have the resources to help everyone who needs it.
So we're basically keeping people trapped in a bad system because we won't properly fund the better one.
It's a messed up situation, that's for sure. And it's not like people haven't tried to change things. Like back in 2014, the Sunset Advisory Commission, they recommended closing 6 SSLCs.
Really? What happened with that?
It got complicated. Some families and advocacy groups pushed back. They were worried about what would happen to the people living in those SSLCs if they shut down. Plus, there were concerns about staff losing their jobs.
So it's like fear of the unknown, even if the unknown might be better.
It's part of it, yeah. And then, of course, you got politics involved. Remember Senate Bill 204 back in 2015?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
It was an attempt to shut down at least one SSLC and then have a committee evaluate all the others. But it failed.
So not a lot of political will to really tackle this issue then. But it's not just about the politicians, is it? I mean, we got to think about the staff in those SSLCs, the working conditions, the pay, the stress.
Absolutely. You can't talk about this without talking about the staff. They're the ones on the front lines of this whole messed up system.
And they're set up to fail, aren't they? I mean, that's not to excuse any abuse or neglect, but the system itself just breeds those kinds of problems.
100%. Blaming individual staff members without fixing the system is like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. It's not going to do anything.
So what do we do? How do we even start to fix this? I mean, it feels like we've just scratched the surface here, and it's already so complicated. Is there even a clear answer? Like, should we just shut down all the SSLCs and say everyone's going into community-based care?
A lot of folks would say that's exactly what needs to happen. They'd say it's the only way to actually make things right, ethically and practically. And, when you look at the data, when you hear those stories, it's hard to argue with that. Community-based care it works.
But it can't just happen overnight, can it? I mean, you're talking about thousands of people, some of whom have lived in these SSLCs for their whole lives.
Absolutely. You got to think about the human impact. You can't just uproot someone, even if the place they're in isn't great. Change is hard. And for some people, it could be really traumatic to leave what they know.
So how do you balance that? The need to make things better, but also the need to make sure you're not hurting people in the process.
Yeah, it's a tough one. There's no easy solution. But I think it starts with a mindset shift. We can't think of SSLCs as the go-to solution anymore.
More like a last resort, right? If there's truly no other option.
Right, and that means investing in those alternatives, the community-based programs. And we're not talking about a little extra funding here or there. We need a real, sustained commitment. Build a system that actually works.
So, okay, funding is huge. But what else needs to happen to make this work, practically speaking?
Well, first off, those waiting lists for community-based programs, that has to change. No one should be stuck in an SSLC because they can't get into the program they need.
That makes sense. It's like you have to open the door so people can actually leave, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when they do leave, you have to make sure there's support. Housing, job training, medical care, transportation, all of it. Because just putting someone in a new place without that support, that's not a solution.
It's about giving them the tools to really build a life for themselves, not just exist.
That's it. But we can't forget about the people still living in SSLCs. The fight for better conditions has to continue. Better training for staff, more oversight, real accountability. We need to change those places from top to bottom.
Because everyone, no matter who they are, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect.
100%. And it's not about charity, it's about justice. Everyone deserves the chance to live a full life, a meaningful life.
This whole thing, it's been tough to hear, but important, It's easy to ignore these problems, but we can't.
You got that right. It's about awareness, sure, but it's got to go beyond that. We got to take that anger, that sadness, and turn it into action. Call your representatives, support the organizations fighting for change, speak up for the people who can't speak up for themselves.
Because change doesn't just happen, does it? It takes work. It takes all of us.
It does. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. I really believe that. If we work together, we can make Texas a better place for everyone. A place where everyone has a chance to live up to their full potential.
So if you're listening to this and something is resonating with you, if you're fired up about this, don't let that go. Hold on to that feeling. Do something with it. Your voice matters, and you can be part of making things better. That's your deep dive.